There are very few things as satisfying as seeing your feed fly by with one kill after another, especially against Rotten Armour on Havoc 40. What was once the most tedious and annoying modifier to fight against is now something I look forward to dealing with because I get to have my kill feed dopamine. Today I'll be bringing you through the second best anti-Rotten Armour or Rot Breaker build I've been using. And yes, I said second best. I'll explain why in just a moment. Rotten Armour comes up constantly in the Darktide community right now, on Reddit, on YouTube, in Discord servers. The core complaint is always the same. Fighting it narrows down your build options so severely that it stops being fun. That complaint gave me an idea. What if I built specifically around it? This is the second entry in what I've been calling my Rot Breaker series. Builds designed from the ground up to make Rotten Armour a non-issue rather than a problem to work around. Now, you're probably wondering if this is the second best, what's the first? The answer to that would be this build, but with the Inferno Staff, sort of. I've already covered a dedicated build for the Inferno Staff Psyker, which is my Cinder Mage build. The mechanics in that build carry over into Havoc 40, and with a little bit of modification, it is by far the quickest way to bring down groups and hordes of Rotten Armour enemies in a flash. Because that build already exists, this one will not use the Inferno Staff as part of the loadout. This is on purpose. Instead, think of this as the more well-rounded alternative. It's stronger against single targets, better at handling the range threats that the Inferno Staff version leaves you exposed to, and is capable of creating mass destruction. So if you're getting bored of just using the Inferno Staff and want to mix up your loadouts and playstyle a bit, then this might be something for you. The centerpiece of this build is the Deimos Force Sword. I think it's the perfect Psyker weapon for this build, striking a powerful balance of high single target damage and incredible crowd control with its heavy thrust, force push and warp strike. For perks, we are taking both carapace and flak damage. The reason for this is that Rotten Armour enemies may have powerful damage resistances, but they are still made up of their core armor types. I have built the Deimos with Uncanny Strike to give us full rending against carapace armor while we have our Force Sword out. I'm also pairing this with Superiority, a seldom seen blessing but does a lot of work for the purposes of this build. Killing an elite or special gives us a stacking 12.5% strength buff up to 3 times for a total of 37.5% strength. There are 2 important mechanics that make Superiority superior to something like Slaughterer. The first stat, it stacks decay 1 at a time, and they each last for 7 seconds. This makes it very forgiving to maintain, allowing you to go around without having kills in between. Secondly, kills made by damage over time effects do not count for Slaughterer stacks. They only count if your Force Sword scores the last hit. In comparison, any kills on elites or specials made by damage over time effects will count for Superiority stacks, making it sync much better with the rest of the build. Something to note for the stats of the weapon, I have mine with low warp resistance. You'll want to find a sword with as low warp resistance as possible, with the highest number being 42%. I'll explain why later in the video. To support this build, we are pairing it with the heavy las pistol, specifically the Mark 10. We have no problems at all if we are in melee, but ranged enemies are the biggest concern for us, and the las pistol gives us the reach that we need to snipe them from afar. I have mine built with flak and maniac damage to gun down shooters, gunners and specials. For the blessings, I have my tried and tested combo of Ghost and Desperado. Ever since I used this combination on my Crit Commissar and again on my Kaifer's Kane video, I can't stop using it. It works so well as a quick draw sniper, but can also save your life from getting gunned down even if you are without cover. This build keeps you in melee a lot. Anything that punishes melee focus, like snipers across the room, a bomber lobbing grenades into your position, a gunner suppressing the corridor you need to advance through, needs to be handled before it becomes a problem. The las pistol is how you do that without closing the gap. For my Curios, I've chosen a combination that produces a nice balance of stats for my Psyker. I've got 2 toughness and 1 health, and I've paired it with 3 combat regen, 2 revive speed, 2 health and 2 toughness. I had initially tried gunner resistance, but I find this build has sufficient defenses to avoid getting turned into Swiss cheese, especially if you can whip out your las pistol in time to get a good shot off. Moving on, let's talk about the all-important talent nodes that we've selected for this build. Besides not having an Inferno Staff, this build differs from the Cinder Mage through the use of Smite, and its supporting nodes to give us a powerful edge over Rotten Armour enemies. Smite on its own is great, It can stun lock an entire horde of Rotten Armour, allowing you to create breathing room and opportunities for your team to attack or retreat. But what makes this build lethal is the combination of Charged Strike and Enfeeble. Charged Strike on its own applies a short electrocution effect that deals a small amount of damage over 2 seconds. Despite dealing damage over time, it isn't classified as a dot and is unfortunately affected by the Rotten Armour's damage resistance. This by itself is not impressive. Enfeeble, on top of applying a 10% damage received debuff on any electrocuted enemy, has a hidden mechanic that works with Charged Strike. I'll defer to Cooley's guide to explain this, but it essentially doubles the total tick amount against most enemies and also increases the damage ramp up rate. Together, these two nodes, when stacked with all other buffs and debuffs we've got going on, can dish out a lot of damage in a short time. Coming back to the Talon build, to support our Charged Strike's damage as well as any Soul Blaze damage we'll be dishing out is Malefic Momentum. Because we are killing enemies with our sword, we're building up a nice warp damage buff that increases the Charged Strike's damage over time. If an enemy happens to die by the damage over time effect, that helps to increase our Four Swords' direct damage instead, creating a positive feedback loop. We'll also be taking Kinetic Presence for the additional 10% damage to elites. This is essentially an additional tier 4 perk on all your weapons, and I feel it's worth much more than 10% cooldown, especially because this build already has a very low cooldown because of Warp Siphon. If you're thinking about your allies, Smite allows you to buy more time in clutch situations, so the loss in cooldown is made up for by the utility that Smite brings in most cases. In my last 6 or so Havoc40 games, the loss of the cooldown aura has not been noticeable, but the increase in elite damage compounds with all direct electrocution and Soul Blaze damage dealt out throughout the mission, especially when battling against the damage resistance from Rotten Armour. Of course, if you disagree, feel free to change it to the cooldown instead. I've also picked Just a Dream to give myself a pretty good damage reduction cushion. We aren't going to be too peril dependent for this build, so we'll pretty much always have a defensive buffer up. We're also taking Venting Shriek and Creeping Flames. Together with Smite, this will be our primary way of dealing with hordes and creating space. This will also be how we'll add fuel to the fire when fighting against Rotten Armour packs. We are taking Warp Siphon into Infire Reborn since we're playing with Soul Blaze a lot. And lastly, we're picking up both Vulnerable Minds and Warp Rider into Warp Ghost. Having low warp resistance on our Force Sword allows us to temporarily buff up our damage with Warp Rider by casting the special and then swapping weapons to cancel the charge. Warp Ghost then allows us to maintain the damage buff for a decent amount of time before needing to recast. This also gives us a tiny bit of toughness restoration via Quietude and acts as an additional top up for Venting Shriek if we are below the 84% peril threshold to apply the maximum amount of Soul Blaze stacks. The reason why we have less than 42% warp resistance is so that we can reach the peril threshold for maximum Soul Blaze stacks in 3 casts of the Four Swords special. When the build is fully up and running, the opening strike to a Havoc40 Rotten Armour Crusher at full health deals around 740 or so damage just from the electrocution damage over time. Given the Crusher's damage resistance at high health, this is almost getting a second heavy thrust attack between your strikes. The lower the health of the Crusher, the greater the damage arising from the electrocution damage, increasing to as high as 900, maybe even 1000 damage over 2 seconds. With your Light 1 and Heavy 2 combos, you can down a Rotten Armour Crusher in 3 combos easily. If you are lucky with your crits, you can bring them down in 2. As Rotten Armour elites start to die, Perilous Combustion spreads Soul Blaze around, causing it to start building up. If you watched my Cinder Mage video before, you'll know that our goal now is to stack as much Soul Blaze as we can on enemies, and then build up stacks of Uncanny Strike, which we are doing naturally, to completely bypass the armor damage modifier of Carapace. Soul Blaze also has the added benefit of not being affected by Rotten Armour's damage resistance scaling, allowing it to deal full damage regardless of the enemy's health. Stacking this up alongside a whole bunch of other buffs can result in Soul Blaze damage that deals upward of 800 damage per tick, making this combination devastating to any group of enemies. Your Force Sword attacks alone should be knocking Rotten Armour to the floor a lot, but if you are getting overwhelmed, whipping out Smite to buy time to reposition or for your dodges to come back is advisable. If you need to buy even more time, casting Venting Shriek before you reach 100% peril will allow you to squeeze your Smite a little longer while applying even more Soul Blaze to enemies in front of you. Remember to use your Venting Shriek further to compound Soul Blaze damage after they have already been set on fire. This lets you maximize the damage output and the time you have to create a chain reaction. With everything we've put together, how does this build perform? Having tested and adjusted the build several times, this build practically solves Rotten Armoured enemies as a serious threat even in Havoc40. This build can deal with lone Rotten Armoured enemies easily, as I've shown with a Havoc 40 Crusher being down in 3 combos, or annihilate entire packs of them given enough time for Perilous Combustion and the Soul Blaze damage to compound. What makes this feel safer rather than just powerful is the combination of control tools. Smite holds the advance of Rotten Armour deathballs long enough for your damage to reach the vulnerable threshold. Venting Shriek clears and seeds simultaneously. The Four Swords Heavy Thrust and Force Push staggers and even knocks crushes to the ground. Between them, you are never simply trading hits with enemies that are absorbing your attacks. You are dictating the terms of the fight. It isn't the fastest way to clear Rotten Armour, the Inferno Staff version still takes the title, but for everything else, this build handles alongside the Rotten Armour problem, like snipers, bombers, mixed hordes, and high Havoc pressure. I'd argue it's the most complete solution I've put together for Psykers. The modifier went from something I really didn't want to do on the mission board to something I actively want to see because I have an ace up my sleeve for it. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.